Hello, everyone. My name is Rafael Forceto. I'm from Brazil. I'm a journalist, international relations analyst, and I'm here to talk about documenting social and climate issues here in my country, Brazil. Um, so this photo is a photo that I took of a little Mambengo Cray boy. Mambengo Cray are usually known as Kayapó abroad with Coati. I'm 29 years old. I have a background in international relations, but I'm passionate about filmmaking and journalism. I'm the winner of the United Nations 2019 Global Youth Video Competition on climate change, and I'm the co-founder of Human Voices, which is a social communications company focused on social and climate issues in Latin America. Our work has been featured in Manga Bay, Civil Leads, Connect for Climate, and other outlets, both in English and Portuguese. Before I start, I just want to give you guys a little overview of what things are like in Brazil. I'm going to be talking mainly about the climate crisis and climate change. So maybe give a little overview about the climate situation in Brazil and the reality of the country. So as we all know, climate change is the defining challenge of our time. It impacts all nations and all peoples. And Brazil is a country that has a very important role within the climate crisis, within combating the climate crisis. For many decades now, Brazil has been taking a leading role in protecting the Amazon and protecting the environment. But this has been changing recently, which we'll get into in a little bit. But what I'd like to mention is that Brazil is a mega diverse country. It's considered the most biodiverse country in the world. It has about 13% of all animal and plant life on Earth, and it plays a central role in the Earth's climate. The Amazon rainforest regulates rainfall in many South American countries and could impact the whole world if it gets deforested to a certain point. 12% of the Earth's freshwater reserves can be found here in Brazil. It's home to over 300 indigenous ethnic groups. I'm reluctant to put an exact number on how many, but it's certainly over 300. And 60% of the Amazon rainforest lies within this country's borders. So we have a huge environmental responsibility, which spans much further than within our own borders. Here's a little graph that I prepared for you guys so you can have an idea, because when people think of Brazil, they usually think of the Amazon rainforest, they usually think of colorful birds and lush waterfalls, lush landscapes. But in reality, we have a very, very, very diverse biome. We have 6 major biomes in the country. The most well-known, of course, is the Amazon, which is a tropical rainforest located here in the upper left. Then we have the Pantanal, which are wetlands. It's the largest flooded grassland in the world. You can think of it, if you're in the United States, somewhat similar to the Everglades. Then we have the Cerrado in the middle, Cerrado. It's a tropical savanna. As you can see here in these pictures, you can have an idea of what the landscapes look like. On the top right, we have the Caatinga, located in the northeast of the country. It's a very desert-like biome full of shrubs, shrubland. We have the Atlantic jungle, which covers almost all of Brazil's coast, including here where I live in the south of Brazil. Here you have, Brazil has the largest Atlantic jungle reserve in the world. And finally, you have the Pampas, which are the Brazilian lowlands. You can also see this biome in the northern Uruguay and Argentina. So as you can see, we have a very diverse ecosystem here, which faces many challenges. Before I even get into this, I'd just like to show this picture on the left, which was taken by an indigenous photographer called Kamikia Kizije. He's a fantastic photographer. And this picture shows deforestation on the left, preparing for ranching and farming. And on the right, where you see all the protected greenland, this is actually indigenous territory. So this is an indigenous reserve, which shows a very large contrast here of just how much the indigenous populations protect the environment and protect their homes. So the current challenges that we face in Brazil, there are many, but the main one we could say is deforestation. And deforestation, you can see that all over the world, but I think Brazil has been really in the spotlight over the past couple of years because of deforestation. It's been a rampant problem for many decades now. It's nothing new, of course, but it has been ramping up over the past couple of years. So the main causes of deforestation are cattle ranching and farming. A lot of cattle ranchers cut down trees so they can open up space for their cattle. Logging, illegal logging. There are a lot of rare trees, a lot of wood and commodities within the Amazon and other biomes, of course, and that causes a lot of land invasions. A lot of people will risk going into indigenous reserves, which are usually highly guarded, to try and cut down these trees to try and get these commodities so they can sell them on the black market. And this is very, very dangerous, of course. Then we have garimpo, which is a Portuguese term for illegal mining. This is one of the main causes, of course. There are people that go deep, deep into the Amazon because it is so rich in gold and other rich minerals. And they'll cut down trees and flood up certain regions so they can mine for gold. And also grilagem, which is land grabbing. All of these involve they involve conflicts that can sometimes turn very violent. It's not uncommon for us to hear about violence in the Amazon, people that were defending their land or people that were invading land, and there's a shootout and people get killed. Unfortunately, it's something that's very, very common. And the further out into larger reserves you go, the more common it becomes. One specific case of, well, actually, I'll get into environmental activism a little further in the presentation, but I'd just like to highlight that between August 2019 and July 2020, so the past year, deforestation in the Amazon surged to a 12-year high. This is a study conducted by the BBC. And that leads to another one of our biggest challenges at the moment, which is governmental irresponsibility. Brazil's government, and mainly its president, Jair Bolsonaro, has been largely criticized over the past couple of years, ever since he assumed office in early 2019, for a lack of environmental action. As I mentioned earlier, Brazil has a huge environmental responsibility, which it has not been owning up to. And in part, that's blamed on the inflammatory rhetoric used from government officials, mainly the president himself, but also the environmental minister, Ricardo Salles, which have emboldened illegal environmental activity, such as the ones mentioned before, the illegal mining, illegal logging, land grabbing, and so on. This puts indigenous groups at risk, but not just indigenous groups, just in general, many people that live in the Amazon, that live in reserves, that are going to be impacted by these invasions, by this conflict. These predatory policies can put their lives at great risk. And the indigenous peoples are some of the ones that are on the front lines. I'd say, in fact, that they're one of the main groups combating the climate crisis on the front lines, combating deforestation. So this on the right here, before I get into the text, this is Chief Raoni Mctutire, very, very, very famous indigenous activist for indigenous rights, also for environmental rights and environmental issues. He was very, very well known in the 80s and 90s. He became, his face was all over television, all over the media, because he was fighting against the Belo Monte Dam, which is the second or third, I think it's the second largest hydroelectric dam in Brazil and the third largest in the world, which at the time threatened to flood many, many, many indigenous reserves. This was in the late 80s. In 2014, the Belo Monte Dam went ahead and was built, but in a much smaller proportion, which did not have, it still had a great environmental impact, of course, and it has very negative aspects, but it did not have the initial huge environmental impact that was the reason that Raoni and other indigenous leaders mobilized against him. So community leaders and activists like Chief Raoni and many others involved in environmental protection, they face many threats of violence. And not just them, but journalists and people that are involved in covering these issues. So they are really risking their lives here for the Amazon rainforest, for the environment. And the indigenous peoples are often referred to as the guardians of the forest because, as we could see in this last slide, they are responsible for a lot of the protection of the environment. Um, the indigenous reserves are some of the best preserved areas in the Amazon, actually. And Human Voices and myself, in our work, in our journalistic work, we really seek to place the indigenous communities at the center of the storytelling narratives. Um, I think that when you look at mainstream media, when you look at really the type of reporting that goes on, especially outside of the country, you usually see experts talking about these issues. You usually see someone who is from a very well-renowned university or something of the sort. Of course, not, they have their merits, of course, talking about the. Our work is focusing on letting the people on the front lines talk about these issues, the people at the forefront of these issues, like Chief Raoni, other indigenous leaders, like activists that are involved in fighting climate change, in fighting these predatory policies. So the first, the latest thing we have worked on with the indigenous communities is the meeting of the Membengo Cray peoples and the Brazilian indigenous leaders, which was called by Chief Raul Matutiri. He invited over 600 from 47 different tribes to Piauaçu village in the state of Mato Grosso in Brazil, which is deep in the Amazon. And there they met for 5 or 6 days, and they discussed the issues that are going on at the moment with the hostilities that indigenous peoples and just any environmental policies in general are facing from the Brazilian government. And they discussed this amongst themselves. They had plenty of support from civil society, but they did not have any governmental support. And this led to the Manifest of Piauaçu, which was a document denouncing Brazilian government's political project of what they say is a political project of genocide, ethnocide, and ecocide. The meeting was very notable for having the participation of indigenous women, youth, LGBT plus voices, and many others that all spheres of their communities were involved in writing, in debating the issues that ended up on this manifest, which is available online. If you look up on Google, the Manifest of Piauaçu, you can read it in its entirety. And in fact, it was presented to PM Boris Johnson last year, shortly after being written, and it has had a very big impact outside of the country. And I think that's like the main issue that we had when it came to the meeting of the Membengo Cray people, is that it was, as journalists, this is an interesting point because as journalists, it's hard to gain access to these people. It's hard to gain access to these situations, to gain the trust to be in there and be reporting on it. Usually journalists from big newspapers, especially from abroad, can get in there with more easily, but they don't necessarily focus on the issues that have to be focused on. And if they do, it's usually very sporadic. Now, the journalists from smaller newspapers that go in there with more frequently, and they'll write and they'll talk about these issues on a basis, they face more of a political backlash. They face more threats and violence because they don't usually have the cover of these big newspapers, of these big media outlets to give them that safety, to give them that credibility. And that's a very big problem because it's of the utmost importance to shine spotlight on indigenous leadership and their practices, which maybe if you look at some big newspapers, you may see every once in a while. But there are smaller newspapers, like, for example, Amazonia Real here in Brazil, that focus on these issues very frequently. and they don't have the resources, they don't have the manpower, they don't have the workforce to guarantee, of course, always the safety of these people. So it's a very, very tough job, a very tough situation, but people are risking themselves and putting themselves on the front lines to make sure that these voices are heard, which is what we plan to do as well through Human Voices. Here are some pictures from this event. As I mentioned, it had a huge participation from all members of their communities. Here on the left, you have three chiefs. Chief Aroni on the left, most left, and then in the middle you have Megaron, and on the right, I'm not sure who that is. On the top right, you have a man and a woman discussing the points that were drafted, and not pictured here, but there's a huge audience around them listening in and giving their opinions on what was voted. And then at the bottom right, you have a youth leader, Kawali Koli, from the Inanawe tribe, uh, talking about the main issues for the Inanawe people. All this happened probably like in January, February, right before COVID-19 reached Brazil. And of course, it had disastrous outcomes here in our country, just as in many other places. But COVID-19 really impacted the indigenous communities in a devastating level. The indigenous populations are particularly susceptible to COVID-19, not just because of immunity issues, but also because there's a lack of health infrastructure in their villages, in their indigenous reserves. Very often, when somebody gets sick, they'll have to be either taken by car or flown out to a hospital in a nearby city, which nearby can mean maybe over 100 miles. But over the past year, there's been, this was checked this morning actually, January 13th, 2021, there's been 45,000 confirmed cases amongst indigenous people, and 161 tribes have been affected. These numbers are according to Brazil's Indigenous People Articulation, APID, which is more of a, this is a more trusted source than maybe what government numbers can tell at the moment. This is a number that's being drafted up by the indigenous people, by their own articulation. So this is usually the number that is used as a reference when it comes to the indigenous communities. Over the past year, many respected leaders, unfortunately, have passed away due to complications from COVID. Here I have two pictured, which is Paulinho Payacan, chief of the Kayapó people in this northern state of Pará. He passed away on July 17th, 2020. On the right, Aritana Yawalapiti, who passed away on August 5th, also a chief of the Yawalapiti people. Both of them are from the Xingu region, the Xingu River Basin. And it's very unfortunate because it's been said, and the indigenous communities often repeat, that every time another passes away, a library burns down. Their knowledge is lost once they pass away. And it's unfortunately, it's a very sad and very, very complicated situation. Many leaders have passed away. These are just two that I chose because they were very present and active at the PRSU meeting. But we have almost 1,000 deaths of indigenous peoples over the past year. And yeah, it's a very, very difficult situation. And I suggest that many indigenous peoples have started their own funds asking for assistance, asking for COVID relief. So if any of you are interested in checking those out later, we can maybe include this in the notes. There are many, many interesting donations that can be made to help the indigenous communities. So moving away a little bit from the indigenous issues, the climate crisis, as we mentioned, impacts all of the country, impacts all of the world, and there is sustainability and mitigation among social and grassroots movements all over the country. I'm going to talk about one specific movement that I've been working with for the past 2 years. That is the Brazil's Landless Workers Movement, also known as the MST. They are a rural peasant workers movement founded in the 1980s at the end of the Brazilian military dictatorship, which ended in 85. I think the MST was founded maybe in 84. They are one of Latin America's largest and most influential social movements, and they are heavily focused on agroecological production. They're invested in sustainable food cultivation and the preservation of biodiversity. In case you don't know what agroecology is, it's a sustainable method of farming that focuses on food production and makes the best use of nature's resources without damaging them. In simpler terms, it's farming without the use of pesticides. And it involves a lot of traditional knowledge which have been handed down inclusively by indigenous peoples. The MST is such a large social movement. I think that they're estimated to have about 1 million members in Brazil, and they're an incredibly diverse movement with indigenous peoples, with all types of minorities and all types of diverse backgrounds. It's very interesting to see because they all exchange information, they all work together, and really try to work to pass this information on. At first, they were just focused on food cultivation, but as time went on, they became more conscious of the impact that pesticides and the conventional type of farming that was done was having on the environment. Thus, they chose to switch to agroecology and agroforestry, which is nothing more than the next level of agroecology. It's agroecology in a forest. They chose to switch to this model to help not only cultivate organic food, but also preserve the environment, preserve the biosphere, and help conserve biodiversity in their region. The benefits of agroecology are many. As I mentioned, mainly biodiversity, food, organic food, and I mean, there are many. I'm not really going to get into it too much right now, but the MST and the agroecological plantations were the focus of our award-winning short in 2019, What is Agroecology? The mini documentary won the UN's 2019 Global Youth Video Competition on climate change, and we were invited to COP25 at the end of 2019 to present the video and talk about their work, which was a great honor. We were very excited to go and really show something that was taken from the local sphere on an international level. That was a very unique opportunity, and that's when it really sparked that these local narratives told by the locals can really attract a lot of attention, not only here but abroad, which is also our focus in producing digital media in English, so we can have the largest audience possible listening to these stories. I included a video here on the presentation, but I'm not going to play it right now. If we make it available later, I guess people can just click on the video and watch. But moving on. So risks, I mentioned these in the past, but this line of work actually does involve a lot of risk. We do this voluntarily. This is, we have our company, we have our job, we have, we are dedicated to these issues, we are dedicated to this work, but we are not only involved in this. This is more of a voluntary thing that we do in our spare time. In our we have day jobs. Just to summarize that, which means that even though we do face risks when we're working with these people, when we're working with this line of work, they're not constant, like the people on the front lines, like the indigenous communities, like the social movements, like the journalists that are out there every day have and face. But that's not to say that we haven't received any threats for our work in the past. Brazil is unfortunately a country that lacks press freedom. According to the Reporters Without Borders, the World Press Freedom Index, Brazil places in 107th out of 180 countries in the world for press freedom. This has been declared the past 2 years since President Bolsonaro has taken office. Unfortunately, there are a lot of threats of violence, a lot of physical attacks against journalists and the media, and these are fueled by hate speech, by disinformation, by fake news. And unfortunately, valid reporting is often dismissed as fake news by opposition, and political polarization intensifies the very real dangers of being on the front lines reporting. And in fact, here's something that I found yesterday, which I was not aware of earlier, but actually applies to our work, which is that there is state-backed spying of the country's own citizens. Here you have a headline from The Independent from October that Brazilian spies tracked their own country's delegates at the International Climate Conference, COP25. They had their eyes out for activists and NGO organizers that were criticizing the government last year. So, I mean, this is this leaves us very worried, of course. But to be honest, we live in a democracy, and even though these risks are very real, that the essence of democracy is that we are here to, tell the truth. We are here to participate in democracy. We must keep reporting, we must keep working, and unfortunately, even though these intimidations will probably only grow stronger with time, we must keep working. Factual reporting is needed now more than ever, especially in regions that don't get the media attention, such as the global south, that other parts of the world do. In fact, I don't even know if over the past year, with all of the things that have been going on politically, the global south is probably more overlooked than ever. And then here I have some current and future projects that Human Voices is working on right now, which I'd like to share with you guys. So we are very focused on climate issues, but we're also focused on social issues. And one of the biggest social questions that we're facing here in Brazil is the migrant crisis, which is usually not shared as often abroad as maybe the European migrant crisis. But Venezuela mainly is a country that has been having many refugees and many migrants fleeing from the country over the past couple of years. I'd say maybe 3, 4. Of course, there's been a steady flow for many years now, but over the last 2 years, 3 years, the Venezuelan migration has really intensified in South America, mainly in countries like Colombia, Argentina, Brazil, Chile. And people are pouring through the border every day. Hundreds of people come across the northernmost border of Brazil, and the situation is very dire. A lot of people in situations of homelessness, in situations of entire families out on the street. There's a lot of actions being taken to help them. The United Nations, UNHCR is there, IO is there, a lot of aid programs. But unfortunately, the volume is so large that it's difficult to really handle all of this at once. And one project that we have right now and the integration of these migrants within Brazilian society. In Brazil, since most of them are pouring into the northern border, a lot are being included in a government program of interiorization, where they are moved to capitals with more infrastructure to handle large groups of migrants and large groups of people in general, like São Paulo, Curitiba, where I live, Rio de Janeiro, and other cities. And a lot that means that the Venezuelan population has really increased in a lot of these cities. And we're working together with Caritas Brasileira, IOM, and USAID on a series of videos which is telling the stories of migrants from different countries and backgrounds, not just Venezuelans, but many different migrants. Here on the left, we have a Venezuelan man on the top left, but we also have a Haitian man and his daughter on the top right, and on the bottom right, on the bottom, we have a Bangladeshi migrant. all of them who work here in the state of Paraná. All of them telling their stories and telling how they got here, what their backgrounds are, and how they managed to integrate into Brazilian society. This is a series of videos we're working on, which we're hoping to have out by the second quarter of 2021. And of course, we'll be publishing this on our website, on our social media, but it will also be published on our partners' social medias like Caritas, and we'll be sure to share these with you. Another issue that we're looking forward to working on is the environmental threats to Quilombola communities. Quilombolas are they live in quilombos, which are the communities of Afro descendants established by slaves who are able to escape from slavery. The last countries to abolish slavery in the Western Hemisphere. We only abolished slavery in 1888. And thus it has a very long, very difficult history of slavery. And we have this unique demographic here, which are the Quilombolas, which are the descendants of these runaway slaves, of these escaped slaves that founded their own communities, usually deep in the jungle. And there is a specific Quilombola community here in the state of Paraná that is facing some serious environmental threats from hydroelectric dams that have been, and not just hydroelectric dams, but just industrial action and industrialization in the region, which has caused lead to bleed out into the river basin and practically poison the water supply. This is a very, very serious issue, which we would love to cover. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, this is something that we do voluntarily. So we're working towards that. We hope to cover this issue by the second quarter of this year. And we have yet to decide on how to do it, whether it will be through articles, whether it will be through films, but we're definitely going to focus on doing this in the best way to get as many people involved, because we think that filmmaking and usually visual arts usually draw more attention. Also, we're working on blogs and articles on diverse topics, and we want to have these blogs and articles written by people that are actually involved on the front lines. So by the indigenous communities, by the Quilombolas, by the migrants, and by social movements, and by other people that are actually involved hands-on in the work that we're talking about here. And finally, filmmaking and reporting is our main objective. We want to produce as many films as possible. We want to report on as many issues as possible. Brazil is a continental country, immense. Of course, there are a million things we would like to get to. Right now, since we're a very small team, and since we work with very limited resources, we're focusing more on the local sphere, but we're trying to produce this material in the best way possible to really get it out there in as many languages as possible, to make it as accessible as we can, so that as many people can hear about these people, about these issues that they might not hear. And that's pretty much what we're working on right now on Human Voices. And I mean, there's a million other things we would love to be working on. But we also, and finally, of course, we want to focus a lot of our reporting and filmmaking this year on the indigenous communities. The reason that we put this on hold, as I mentioned earlier, is because of the pandemic. We're focusing more on regional reporting because, of course, we don't want to put neither other people or ourselves at risk. But as soon as the pandemic's over, we hope to once again really get into hands-on reporting with the indigenous communities and back into the Amazon. And that's pretty much it for me. Thank you all for your time. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and I leave here some contact information, both for myself and for my company. So please feel free to get in touch, whether you have questions, whether you have suggestions, and I'll look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.